All right, so we're ready to start adding some charts to both the solar and the wind energy areas of this infographic. Now let's jump over to the final PDF for a moment to see what we're going to be creating here. We're going to focus in this movie on creating this chart for wind energy, where we have all these beautiful turbines that help us identify how much wind energy is generated in the United States over the past couple of years. Now we can kind of see how that number has grown. Likewise, if you look to the left here, you'll see that we're also going to create a chart for solar energy generation. Now, it's pretty evident from here that the amount of solar energy that's being generated is nowhere near the amount of wind energy that's being generated. But I'll tell you that when I first started sketching out the data, that wasn't readily apparent to me. So let's jump back to Illustrator and let me show you exactly what I mean by that and how we have to be really careful when you create charts that are near each other to make sure that they're using the same scale. So let's go back to Illustrator here. And I'm going to be creating the wind chart here and the solar chart over here. But I'm actually going to create a brand new document here for a moment just to show you the difference in scale between these two graphs. But more importantly, how if you don't kind of clue Illustrator in on what you're doing, Illustrator may not help you understand that. In fact, Illustrator may kind of give you results that look deceiving. So I'm going to press Command N or Control N to create a new document. Just create a print document here. Let's make it wide instead of tall and click OK. Now, I really want to create two column charts here. So I'm going to go over here to Illustrator's Graph Tools, click and hold, and choose the Column Graph tool. I'm going to click over here and create a graph that's about 4 inches by 4 inches square. And I want to import some data for this. So I'm going to click on this button to import the data. Let's go to the data folder inside of my exercise files folder. I'll choose text because remember we can't place native Excel documents here. And I'll choose the wind energy generation first. Click Open, click on the checkbox over here to apply those values, and that looks great. But notice the values that appear here on the left side of this axis. This is the value axis, and it starts at 0 and it goes up to 300,000. This is happening because previously, at the top of our infographic, we created a graph that was a line graph, and we specified those values for what the tick mark should be. So let's actually go over to the Object menu, choose Graph, and then choose Type. And where it says Graph Options, I'm going to choose Value Axis. And you can see that the last setting that we used in Illustrator was to override those calculated values. I'm actually going to go and uncheck that box and click OK so that way Illustrator can use its own default settings. So basically it sees the value inside of this chart and it fills up that 4 inches using whatever values it decides to calculate. So now let's say we want to create another chart. I still have my column graph tool selected, so I'm going to click over here. And again, the same 4 inches by 4 inches, click OK. And now let's import the values for the solar data. Click on the Import button, go to US Solar Generation, click Open, apply those settings, and then close this. Now let's kind of line up these two charts side by side. I have solar here on the right, and I have wind here on the left. Now when I'm immediately looking at this, they look pretty similar. In fact, it looks like solar has really been growing a lot and is almost the same that wind is. But if I'm not paying close attention to the values here on the value axis, I see that this maxes out at 8,000 while this maxes out at 120,000. In other words, the highest value on this chart over here doesn't even come close to the first value that I see on this chart. But because Illustrator is automatically scaling my chart to fit within that bounds of 4 inches by 4 inches, my eye immediately perceives these two as almost equals. So I really need to make sure that both of these charts are playing by the same rules. So I can select this chart here for wind, go to the Object menu, choose Graph, and then choose Type. I'm going to switch over here to the value axis, and now I do want to override the calculated values. I'm going to leave the minimum set to 0. But I'm going to set the maximum to 100,000. I'm also going to specify that there should be 10 divisions. So basically, 1 for every 10,000. And now I'll click OK. Now I just need to make sure that the chart on the right, the solar chart, is using those same values as well. So I'm going to click on this option right here. Again, go to Object, Graph, Type, switch to the value axis, override the calculated values, choose a minimum of 0 and a maximum of the same that I used before, which is 100,000, and then use the same 10 divisions, and click OK. And now you can see that the scale of values are the same across both charts. And you can see that there's really a huge difference between solar and wind energy. It was only when I started to do this that I realized I needed to change my design and accurately display the difference between solar and wind. Yes, both are growing very quickly, but that doesn't mean that they're equal. So by displaying data in this way, I'm making sure that I'm telling an accurate story through my infographic. Now, the first chart that we want to create is actually the one for wind. So I have that right here. I'm actually going to go ahead now and select this chart. I'll actually select both of them, and I'll copy them. And let's switch back now to our document, which is Renewable Energy 08, and paste them in. I'm just going to take the solar one right now and move it off to the side. And I'll take the wind one and bring it right about over here. Just nudge it over just a little bit so the graph is kind of centered. That looks pretty good right here. And what I'd like to do is actually style this chart so it looks a little bit more interesting. Considering what those wind turbines look like, I thought it might be cool to use that as a design for this graph. In fact, it's pretty easy to create a sliding graph design so that I can make this chart a little bit more interesting. So let's go ahead and do that. I didn't want to bother drawing one of those wind turbines from scratch, but it was pretty easy to find one on a stock image site like ThinkStock, for example. I'm going to go to the File menu and choose Open. And inside the exercise files folder for Chapter 4, if I scroll down, I'll see a file called Wind Turbine Art. I'm going to go ahead and open up that document. And I'll see this error that I don't actually have the font that's used in that document, which is fine because we're going to change it. So I'm going to choose Open. Let me press Command-0 to center this on my screen. And I want to show you what this piece of artwork is actually made up of. I have the wind turbine itself, but I also created a gray box here. It's actually filled with a 20% gray. But if you look at my opacity panel, you'll see that that object is set to multiply. So basically, it's going to darken any background that it appears on top of. Just above it here, I've also created a gradient that goes from 20% gray to none. And this too is set to multiply, so that now when this stretches, it'll appear as if that bar kind of fades to none, but it will multiply with its background. I've also created a line here, or a guide. This guide is going to indicate to Illustrator what the sliding point is in this piece of artwork, so that when this is stretched from top to bottom, Illustrator knows where to stretch it from. Now, I've also added some text here. And remember, this text will allow Illustrator to display the actual value of the chart here. If I click on it, you can see it's now aligned right. But as we noted before, because we had a font error, we need to replace it with a font that we have. So I just want to show you, you don't actually have to do this manually by clicking on the typeface itself. There's a really powerful feature inside of Illustrator that lets you replace fonts in your document. I'm going to go to the Type menu. Again, I have nothing selected. I'm going to choose Find Font. And Illustrator is going to let me know that there's a font called Chaparral Pro Caption, but I don't have that typeface. So I have the ability to replace it with something else. So where it says replace with font from, I'm going to choose, let's replace it from some font that's existing in my system. So for example, I have something called Chaparral Pro. This is regular. So I'm going to click on this option. Basically what I'm telling Illustrator to do is, wherever you see Chaparral Pro Caption in this document, replace it with Chaparral Pro, which is what I do have installed in my system. I can now choose Change All. And now you can see that what fonts are currently in my document, just Chaparral Pro. I basically removed the font that I don't have. Now I'm going to click Done, and I'm going to take my selection tool, marquee select this entire piece of artwork right now, and I realize that the guide is not being selected, and that's because my guides are currently locked. I need to make sure that guide comes along because that is key for identifying what the sliding point of my artwork is. So I'm going to right-click and choose to unlock my guides, or you can of course go to the View menu, go down to Guides, and then choose to unlock them from here. Now once again, I'll go ahead and select all this artwork. Now I see the guide is selected. I'll copy, then switch back to my renewable energy document, and I'll paste it. Right now it's the only piece of artwork that's selected. I'll go to the Object menu, go down to where it says Graph, and choose Design because I want to define this as a design. Now this document already has that defined here for column wind, so I'm simply going to go ahead now and select it and choose to delete it. And now I'm going to use the new piece of artwork that I just created. So let's create a new design. Let's go ahead now and rename it. Let's call it Column Wind, and I'll click OK. Now when I click OK, I don't need this artwork anymore, so I'm simply going to go ahead now and hit delete. There's no more need for me to have it in this document. So at this point, I would like to specify that Illustrator use that piece of artwork or that design for the columns in this chart. So I'll select the chart. We only really have one series of data here. So I could simply go to the Object menu, scroll down to where it says Graph, and then choose Column. Here I'm going to choose Column Wind, and for column type, I'm going to choose that we want it to be sliding. And now I'll click OK. So now you can see that that piece of artwork has now been added to this chart, but they're really very small and narrow. So I want to modify how it looks inside of this chart. I'm going to go over here to the Object menu. I'm going to choose Graph, then I'll choose Type, and over here for Options, I'm going to change my column width to 125%, hit the Tab key, and then change the cluster width also to 125%. Now when I click OK, I can see that those turbines have gotten much bigger. You can also clearly see that the numbers now appear here as well. So the values for each of these data points are now appearing here. But upon closer inspection, you can see that the turbine here, even though it extends into the next one here, is being covered over by the background for this. So I basically want the first data series to kind of be at the front, not the last data series. So I'm just going to select my chart right now, go back to Object, Graph, Type, and I'm going to choose First Row in Front, and click OK. Now I just want to do a few things here to style this graph a little bit better. Because I have the values that appear next to it here, I actually don't need to see the value axis at all. But if I were to ungroup this and delete them, I wouldn't be able to come back later on and change the data. Unfortunately, there's no way just to instruct Illustrator to not display the value axis. So the way that I'll make it quote-unquote disappear is by setting its fill and stroke to none. So I'll switch to my Direct Selection tool. I'll hold down my Option key and click once on this value, pause for a second, and then click again. And that's now going to select all those values, and I'll change its fill color to none. Next, I'm going to click on one of these tick marks right here, using the Option key that selects one of them. And then again, I'll click again with the Option or Alt key pressed down, and then a third time. That basically selects everything here, and I'll change the fills to none and also the strokes to none. So now, even though they're there in my document, I don't see them because they have a no fill, no stroke attribute. I actually want to change the way that the numbers appear here at the bottom. So I'm going to Option click on this one right here, and then Option click again to select all of them. And I want them to match the styling of the letters that appear here in this chart. So I'm going to use my eyedropper tool, which is right here. The keyboard shortcut is the letter I, and I'm just going to click on that one right here. The only thing, though, is I want this to be the color of wind, not that renewable green color. So I'm simply going to come here now to the swatches panel and choose the wind color. So at this point here, I'm going to switch back to my selection tool, deselect my artwork. I've now added the chart for wind to the bottom of my infographic. I'll go to the File menu and I'll choose Save As. Let's call this 09. Save my file and click OK in the dialog here. And in the next movie, we'll add the chart for solar energy here on this side of the infographic.